It's 7:22 here in the French capital, 6:22 in London. It's time now for a quick look at the papers. And Oliver Farry joins us for the review of the French press. And it's François Hollande who's dominating most of the headlines.
That's right. The president becomes the first French leader to visit Cuba since the island's independence in 1898. Libération goes for a rather obvious Photoshop job on its front cover, superimposing François Hollande's face onto the famous Alberto Korda photograph of Che Guevara. Libé reminds us that the president arrives in Cuba at the very moment that the island is opening up to foreign capital. It's a historical irony, says the left-leaning daily, given that a part of the French left has long believed in the Castroist sirens. Inside correspondent Laure Breton says François Hollande sells the dream in Havana, but also dreams of selling. The president, who is in no way a leftist, lands with 7 ministers on the island where public spending makes up 60% of GDP, 13% of it going to education, and that's a world record. She also quotes one of those ministers who says it'll do the socialists no harm to rediscover a taste for revolution. But we're not exactly sure what the real motives for this are. Is it really a leftist renaissance among the French Socialist Party? The political scientist René Fragosi, who is interviewed by Libération, says she doubts that tropical communism fascinates François Hollande, much less Manuel Valls. She says it's most likely MEDEF, the French Business Confederation, that has insisted on the trip, intended to tie up a few contracts, as a large delegation of company directors is accompanying the president.
Well, this all follows on, of course, from the improved relations between Cuba and the United States. And France is really kind of stealing a march, even on Washington in this respect.
Yeah, they've got in there before anyone else. It's the first trip by a Western head of state since the 1959 revolution. Now, Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau made a highly publicised visit in 1976, but strictly speaking, he wasn't a head of state. The French communist newspaper L'Humanité is overjoyed at the news. At last, a French president in Cuba. Now, the path is now clear for an end to the blockade, but there's a certain bitterness to it. L'Humanité says the visit's a welcome one, though it testifies to a narcotic dependence on American policy. French diplomacy, I quote, is such a vassal that it dares not depart from the code of conduct decreed by Washington, and that Paris also warmly followed the State Department in boycotting the ceremony in Moscow commemorating the defeat of the Nazis. Wake up, de Gaulle, they've gone mad, and when L'Humanité is appealing to the late general, you know something is amiss. Now, elsewhere in the French press, there's coverage of Cuban dissidents that François Hollande will not be meeting. Slate.fr carries a piece by Frédéric Martel in which he quotes the opposition activist Berta Soler Fernandez, whose husband has spent several years in a Cuban jail. She says coming to Cuba without meeting civil society is giving the regime the endorsement to continue its repression. She continues, I'm very concerned about France's strategy. President Hollande cannot visit the country without asking questions about human rights and without seeing civil society. This is not France. This is not Europe.
Well, it's been quite an eventful Caribbean tour for François Hollande, hasn't it? Any other aspects make it into the papers?
Yeah, he inaugurated in Guadeloupe yesterday the Slavery Memorial, and he spoke of the irreparable nature of this crime. The Catholic daily Le Croix says it's a long overdue official recognition and not without consequences, according to the historian Éric Deroux. The traces of slavery are still very present today in the Caribbean, very strong. He says there are things that have not been settled, but some Caribbean people have been demanding financial compensation, reparations for the suffering of their ancestors. Deroux himself says this is a memorial competition in bad taste. He says it's a problem that cannot be resolved with money alone.
And the French president has also denounced the new slave traders of the Mediterranean, hasn't he? That's referring to that crisis we've been seeing lots of.
That's right. Le Figaro says the EU is to present at the UN Security Council a resolution aimed at using military means from June onwards to destroy the boats of smugglers bringing migrants from Libya to Europe. The right-leaning paper mentions the alarming silence of African leaders who are quick to accuse the West and its supposed disastrous intervention in Libya, not so much to look at themselves. He says African leaders prefer not to raise these questions. Things are not going to get better on their own, and migrants are going to rush towards these suicide journeys for want of a better solution.
Oliver Farry with the press review. Thanks very much for that.